Sarah Martinez had learned long ago that respect wasn't given. It was earned with blood, sweat, and the kind of courage that made grown men tremble. Standing in that crowded military briefing room, surrounded by decorated officers who saw only a young woman in civilian clothes, she knew they were about to discover why her codename struck fear into the hearts of America's enemies. The laughter would stop soon enough. It always did when someone finally asked the right question. Who exactly is Winter Siren? What they didn't know was that behind her quiet demeanor lay a warrior forged in the coldest, most unforgiving missions the military had to offer. A woman whose reputation preceded her in every shadowy corner of special operations. A legend they were about to meet face to face. The room was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. The conference room at Fort Bragg buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that preceded high-stakes military briefings. Officers in dress uniforms filled the chairs around the massive oak table, their chests adorned with ribbons and medals that told stories of courage under fire. The air was thick with testosterone and the weight of important decisions waiting to be made. Sarah Martinez walked into this masculine fortress wearing simple black slacks and a white blouse, carrying nothing but a small leather portfolio. At 28, she possessed an understated beauty that she had learned to downplay in professional settings. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her brown eyes swept the room with quiet observation. To the assembled military elite, she looked like someone's assistant, perhaps a secretary who had wandered into the wrong meeting. The whispers started immediately. "Who's the civilian?" muttered Major Harrison, a decorated Army Ranger with 3 tours in Afghanistan under his belt. His voice carried just enough volume to be heard by those nearby, which was exactly his intention. Captain Williams, a Marine with a chest full of commendations, leaned back in his chair with obvious amusement. Probably someone from the State Department. They always send these young staffers to take notes. Colonel Peterson, a grizzled veteran of both Iraq wars, didn't bother lowering his voice. "I hope she's not here to tell us how to run our operations. These desk jockeys think they understand warfare because they've read about it in textbooks." The chuckles rippled through the room like a wave. Sarah found an empty chair near the back and settled into it without a word, opening her portfolio and withdrawing a single sheet of paper. She glanced at it briefly, then placed it face down on the table in front of her. Her movements were precise, economical, betraying none of the irritation that might have been expected. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, who was running the meeting, called for attention. "Gentlemen, we're here to discuss Operation Northern Sweep, a critical mission that requires our most experienced personnel." His eyes briefly met Sarah's, and she detected a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't been told about her either. "Sir," Captain Williams interrupted, his tone respectful but pointed, "are we supposed to discuss classified operations with civilians present?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Every eye in the room turned to Sarah, who remained perfectly still, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Her face revealed nothing, but those who knew her well would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes, a warning sign that these men were about to step on a landmine. "I'm sure there's been some mistake," Major Harrison added, his voice carrying a patronizing tone that suggested he was doing everyone a favor by pointing out the obvious. "Miss, I think you might be in the wrong room. The administrative offices are down the hall." A few more officers joined in with barely suppressed laughter. Colonel Peterson actually smiled as he spoke. "Nothing personal, young lady, but this is a military briefing. Very classified stuff. You understand." Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I understand perfectly, Colonel." Her accent was neutral, giving no clue to her background. She could have been from anywhere in America, which was exactly how she had trained herself to sound. In her line of work, being forgettable was often the difference between success and failure, between coming home and disappearing forever. "Good," Peterson continued, emboldened by what he perceived as compliance. "Why don't you run along and tell whoever sent you that we'll need the real briefing materials later?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Around the table, other officers nodded in agreement. They had seen this before, young government employees who got lost in the maze of military bureaucracy, ending up in meetings far above their security clearance. Major Harrison decided to drive the point home. This isn't a place for civilians to play soldier. We deal with life and death situations here. Real warfare, not the sanitized version you see on news. Sarah's expression didn't change, but she reached for the paper in front of her and turned it over. The movement was so casual that most of the men didn't notice it, too busy enjoying what they saw as an easy victory over an out-of-place civilian. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, however, was paying attention. His eyes caught the letterhead on the paper, and his face went pale. He cleared his throat loudly, tried to regain control of the situation, but the damage was already done. Captain Williams wasn't finished. "Look, I'm sure you're very good at whatever it is you do, filing reports, answering phones, making coffee. But this is the big leagues. We can't have someone taking notes who doesn't understand the gravity of what we're discussing." The laughter in the room grew louder. These were men accustomed to being the apex predators in any situation, and they were enjoying asserting their dominance over what they perceived as an intruder in their domain. "Maybe she's here to remind us about sexual harassment training," joked Captain Torres, a Navy SEAL with an impressive record in counterterrorism. "The Pentagon's been pushing that pretty hard lately." The comment drew more chuckles, and Sarah finally allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't the reaction they expected, and it should have served as a warning. But they were too caught up in their own superiority to notice. Colonel Peterson, feeling like he was on a roll, decided to make one final point. "Nothing against you personally, but war isn't a place for people who haven't earned their stripes. Some of us have spent decades learning how to keep this country safe. We've bled for it, lost friends for it. This isn't a game." Sarah stood up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. The room quieted slightly, expecting her to leave in embarrassment. Instead, she picked up her paper and took a step forward. "You're absolutely right, Colonel," she said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "War isn't a game, and some people have indeed bled for this country." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room, making brief contact with each officer. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press against everyone present. "The question is, how much have you bled compared to Winter Siren?" The name hit the room like a physical blow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Laughter died in throats. Several officers actually flinched as if they had been struck. Winter Siren. Every person in that room knew the name, though most had never expected to meet the person behind it. It was whispered in the darkest corners of special operations, spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. The operator who had single-handedly extracted 3 hostages from a Taliban stronghold in conditions so severe that 2 members of the rescue team had suffered frostbite. The ghost who had eliminated a high-value target in the mountains of Afghanistan during a blizzard so fierce that satellite surveillance was impossible. Captain Torres, the Navy SEAL who had been joking just moments before, leaned forward in his chair. "You're telling us that you're—" "I'm telling you that assumptions can be dangerous," Sarah replied, placing her paper on the table where everyone could see it. It was a mission brief with her photograph attached, along with a security clearance level that was higher than anyone else in the room. But, more importantly, at the top of the page, in bold letters, was her operational call sign, Winter Siren. Major Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The man who had suggested she was lost and belonged in administrative offices was now staring at someone whose kill count was classified, but rumored to be in the double digits. Colonel Peterson, who had lectured her about earning stripes and bleeding for the country, found himself looking at a woman who had earned her reputation in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. The Winter Siren was known for operating in conditions that would kill most soldiers before they even encountered the enemy. The silence stretched until Lieutenant Colonel Davis finally found his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEALs." Call sign, Winter Siren. The revelation hit different officers at different moments. Some had heard stories. Others had read classified reports with her name redacted, but her actions legendary. All of them suddenly understood that they had just made fools of themselves in front of one of the most decorated special operations personnel in the military. Captain Williams, who had suggested she belonged in filing reports, realized he was looking at someone who had spent the last 8 years in roles so classified that most of her missions would never be declassified in his lifetime. Senior Chief, he stammered, trying to recover his composure. We didn't realize. Sarah held up a hand, stopping his apology before it could fully form. You didn't realize because I didn't announce myself. That's how I prefer to operate. But let me be clear about something. She moved around the table with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to moving silently through enemy territory. Every step was deliberate, controlled, intimidating in its quiet confidence. I'm not here to take notes. I'm not here to remind you about training requirements. I'm here because Operation Northern Sweep is my mission. I designed it, I planned it, and I will execute it. The only question is whether any of you are qualified to support me. The room was so quiet that the air conditioning seemed loud. These were men accustomed to being in charge, to being the most dangerous people in any room. Suddenly, they found themselves in the presence of someone whose reputation made their own accomplishments seem ordinary by comparison. Major Harrison, who had started this whole debacle, finally managed to speak. Senior Chief, I owe you an apology. We all do. We made assumptions that were completely out of line. Sarah studied him for a long moment. In that silence, everyone could see her evaluating him, deciding whether he was worth her time and respect. It was a humbling experience for a man who was used to being the one doing the evaluating. Apology noted, Major, she finally said. But apologies don't complete missions. Competence does. The question now is whether we can move past this embarrassing display and focus on the task at hand. Colonel Peterson, still stunned by the revelation, shook his head slowly. Winter Siren, I've read about your work in the Hindu Kush. The extraction at observation post Restrepo. The elimination of the Chechen bomb maker. Those weren't just missions, they were miracles. They were jobs that needed doing, Sarah replied, her voice devoid of false modesty. And they got done because I don't waste time worrying about what other people think of me. I worry about results. She returned to her seat, but the dynamic in the room had completely changed. Where before she had been an outsider, now she was clearly the center of authority. The officers who had dismissed her minutes earlier were now hanging on her every word. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, grateful to finally regain some control of his briefing, cleared his throat. Senior Chief Martinez has been assigned as the operational commander for Northern Sweep. The mission parameters are unlike anything we've attempted before. Sarah opened her portfolio again, this time withdrawing a thick stack of documents. The target is a terrorist cell operating in the Alaskan wilderness. They've established a base camp at an altitude of 8,000 feet in terrain that becomes inaccessible by conventional means for 6 months of the year. She distributed copies of aerial reconnaissance photos showing a landscape that looked more like the surface of an alien planet than anywhere on Earth. Snow-covered peaks stretched to the horizon, broken only by deep valleys that seemed to swallow light itself. The weather window for this operation is closing rapidly, Sarah continued. We have maybe 2 weeks before winter conditions make approach impossible. The target has been using this location to plan attacks on pipeline infrastructure. If we don't stop them now, we won't get another chance until spring. Captain Torres studied the photographs with a professional eye. Senior Chief, this looks like a job for a full platoon. Maybe 2 platoons. The logistical challenges alone are exactly why I'm here, Sarah interrupted. This isn't a job for a large force. Large forces leave large footprints. Large footprints get people killed in terrain like this. This is a job for a small team that can move fast and strike hard. Major Harrison, still trying to recover from his earlier embarrassment, leaned forward. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Insertion in 72 hours. Weather reports show a brief clear period that will give us maybe 6 hours to get in position. After that, we'll have approximately 18 hours to locate, neutralize, and extract before the next storm system moves in. The scope of the challenge was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't just a difficult mission, it was nearly impossible. The margin for error was essentially zero. Colonel Peterson, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine respect, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Senior Chief, what do you need from us?" Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just been asked about her hunting preferences. "I need you to remember that the next time someone walks into your briefing room, you might want to ask who they are before you decide what they're worth." The message was clear. These officers had learned a valuable lesson about assumptions and respect. More importantly, they had learned that Winter Siren was not just a legend whispered in dark corners. She was a real person with real capabilities, and she was about to remind everyone why her reputation had been earned in blood and ice. Sarah Martinez stood alone in the equipment bay at 0500 hours, methodically checking gear that most soldiers would never see, let alone use. The specialized cold weather equipment told the story of missions that existed only in classified files and the nightmares of those who had survived them. Each piece had been selected not just for functionality, but for the margin between life and death that existed in environments where nature itself was the enemy. The door opened behind her, and she didn't need to turn around to know who had entered. The measured footsteps belonged to someone with military bearing, but the slight hesitation told her this person was nervous about approaching Winter Siren directly. "Senior Chief Martinez?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Jack Morrison, a young SEAL who had graduated top of his class 6 months earlier. His file indicated exceptional performance in training, but training and reality were two very different things. Sarah turned, taking in the officer who would be her second in command. Morrison was tall and lean, with the kind of eager intensity that marked soldiers who had never been truly tested. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots gleamed, and his confidence was the kind that came from success in controlled environments. "Lieutenant," Sarah acknowledged, returning to her equipment check. "You're early." "Yes, Senior Chief. I wanted to review the mission parameters again before the team briefing." Morrison stepped closer, his eyes widening as he took in the array of equipment. "I've never seen some of this gear before." Sarah held up a specialized breathing apparatus designed for high-altitude operations in sub-zero temperatures. "This little device keeps your lungs from freezing when the air temperature drops below -40. Without it, you die in about 6 minutes." The casual way she delivered this information made Morrison swallow hard. The lieutenant had trained in cold weather operations, but the coldest environment he had experienced was a controlled exercise in Colorado during late autumn. "Senior Chief, I've read your file. What you accomplished in the Hindu Kush, the Tora Bora extraction, these are legendary operations. I'm honored to serve under your command." Sarah set down the breathing apparatus and fixed Morrison with a stare that seemed to look through him. "Lieutenant, I don't need your honor. I need your competence. The question is, do you have it?" Before Morrison could answer, the bay door opened again, and 3 more men entered. Sarah recognized them from their files, but seeing them in person allowed her to make the kind of assessments that photographs couldn't provide. Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez was a mountain warfare specialist with 12 years in special operations. His weathered face spoke of time spent in hostile environments, and his movements had the economical grace of someone who conserved energy as a matter of survival. He was the kind of soldier who didn't waste words or motion. Staff Sergeant Mike Chun, an explosives expert whose precision with demolitions had earned him recognition throughout special operations communities, carried himself with quiet confidence. His hands, Sarah noted, were steady, an essential trait for someone whose job involved working with volatile materials under pressure. The third man was Petty Officer First Class Tom Bradley, a communications specialist whose ability to maintain contact in impossible conditions had saved more lives than anyone kept count of. His eyes constantly scanned the room, taking in details with the awareness of someone who understood that information was often the difference between success and failure. "Gentlemen," Sarah addressed the group without preamble, "you volunteered for what many would consider a suicide mission. Before we go any further, I need to know if any of you want to reconsider that decision." The four men exchanged glances, each taking the measure of the others. This was the moment when teams were either forged or broken, when the reality of what lay ahead separated those who could handle the pressure from those who merely thought they could. Rodriguez spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "Senior Chief, I've read the mission brief. High-altitude insertion in winter conditions, hostile terrain, enemy forces of unknown strength. It's dangerous, but it's not impossible. Not with the right team." Shin nodded his agreement. "The technical challenges are significant, but manageable with proper preparation. The explosive requirements for this mission are within my capabilities." Bradley's response was characteristic of a communications specialist, measured and precise. "Command and control will be difficult given the terrain and weather conditions, but I can maintain contact with headquarters throughout the operation." All eyes turned to Morrison, the least experienced member of the team. Sarah watched him carefully, looking for signs of the doubt that could get everyone killed. Leadership in special operations wasn't about giving inspiring speeches. It was about recognizing when someone wasn't ready for what lay ahead. "Senior Chief," Morrison began, his voice steady despite what Sarah could see was considerable anxiety. "I know I don't have your experience, or the experience of these men, but I've trained for this my entire career. I won't let the team down." Sarah studied him for a long moment. She had worked with young officers before, and she knew that courage came in different forms. Some people were naturally fearless. Others became brave by choosing to act despite their fear. The key was knowing which type you were dealing with. "Lieutenant, fear is not the enemy. Stupidity is the enemy. Carelessness is the enemy. Fear keeps you alive if you use it correctly." She moved to a large map mounted on the wall. "Let me show you what we're really dealing with." The map displayed the target area in Alaska, a region so remote that the nearest road was over 200 miles away. Red markers indicated known enemy positions, while blue lines showed the planned infiltration route. The target is a terrorist cell led by Viktor Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operative who has been planning attacks on critical infrastructure. Sarah traced the route with her finger. "He's chosen this location specifically because he knows it's nearly impossible to reach during winter months." She moved to a series of weather charts showing temperature readings, wind speeds, and storm patterns. The numbers painted a picture of an environment that challenged the limits of human survival. "Average temperature during our operation window will be minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Factor in wind chill, and we're looking at effective temperatures approaching minus 60. Altitude will be 8,000 feet, which means reduced oxygen and increased fatigue." Rodriguez studied the charts with professional interest. "Frostbite becomes a real concern at those temperatures. How long will we be exposed?" "Initial insertion will require a 12-mile trek across open terrain. If everything goes according to plan, we'll be exposed to those conditions for approximately 8 hours. If things go wrong..." Sarah let the implication hang in the air. Shin raised a practical concern. "Senior Chief, at those temperatures, equipment failure becomes exponentially more likely. Batteries die faster, metal becomes brittle, lubricants freeze." "Which is why we're carrying backup systems for our backup systems," Sarah replied. "Every piece of essential equipment has been cold weather tested down to minus 50 degrees. We're not taking any chances with gear failure." Morrison was studying the tactical portion of the map, trying to understand the approach Sarah had planned. "Senior Chief, this route takes us through several choke points. If the enemy has scouts posted..." "They do," Sarah confirmed. "Which is why we'll be moving at night, during a snowstorm, when visibility is less than 10 feet. The weather that makes this mission nearly impossible also provides the concealment we need to reach the target undetected." The audacity of the plan was becoming clear to everyone in the room. Sarah was proposing to use the hostile environment as both an obstacle and an advantage turning the very conditions that made the mission dangerous into tools for achieving surprise. Bradley pulled out a communications device that looked like nothing he had used before. "Senior Chief, this equipment. I've never worked with this model. It's prototype gear designed specifically for extreme environment operations. The standard comm equipment would fail within hours in these conditions. This system has been hardened against both temperature and electromagnetic interference." Sarah moved to a rack of weapons that had been specially modified for cold weather operations. Each rifle had been equipped with heating elements to prevent ammunition and firing mechanisms from freezing. "Gentlemen, I need to be clear about something. This mission requires a level of mental and physical toughness that goes beyond normal special operations parameters. We will be operating in conditions that kill people simply through exposure. The enemy is secondary to the environment itself." She paused, allowing that reality to sink in before continuing. "I have operated in these conditions before. I know what they do to your body, your mind, your judgment. Some of you will experience hallucinations due to oxygen deprivation and extreme cold. Some of you will want to quit to lie down and give up." Rodriguez nodded grimly. He had experienced mountain warfare in winter conditions, though never to this extreme. "What's the abort protocol if someone becomes incapacitated?" "We don't abort," Sarah replied without hesitation. "We adapt. If someone becomes incapacitated, the rest of the team continues the mission. That's the reality of special operations in extreme environments." The finality of her statement created a moment of profound silence. Each man was forced to confront the possibility that he might not return home, that his teammates might have to choose between saving him and completing the mission. Morrison broke the silence with a question that revealed both his inexperience and his intelligence. "Senior Chief, why was this mission assigned to such a small team? Wouldn't a larger force have better odds of success?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time, there was genuine warmth in the expression. "Lieutenant, that's exactly the right question. The answer is that larger forces have larger logistical requirements. They need more food, more water, more shelter. In an environment like this, logistics become the primary limiting factor." She gestured to the equipment around them. 5 people can move fast and light. 5 people can shelter in spaces that would be inadequate for larger forces. 5 people can disappear in terrain where a platoon would be impossible to conceal. Chun was examining the explosive charges that had been prepared for the mission. "These are configured for structural demolition. Are we planning to bring down their entire facility?" The intelligence indicates they're operating out of a network of caves connected by artificial tunnels. Standard assault tactics would require clearing each position individually, which would take too long and alert other cells to our presence. Sarah moved to a set of architectural drawings. "Instead, we're going to collapse the entire complex with precisely placed charges." The tactical elegance of the plan was impressive. Rather than engaging in prolonged combat in hostile territory, the team would destroy the enemy's capability to operate from that location permanently. Bradley raised a concern about the communications aspects. "Senior Chief, once we trigger those explosions, every hostile force in the region will know our approximate location. How do we extract under those conditions?" "We don't extract the way we came in," Sarah replied. "We move to an alternate extraction point here." She indicated a location on the map that was even more remote than their target. "It's a longer route, but it takes us through terrain where pursuit becomes impossible." Rodriguez studied the extraction route and whistled low. "Senior Chief, that's a 20-mile trek through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. In winter conditions, with potential pursuit, which is why we're going to complete this mission, Sergeant, because the alternative is worse." Sarah's voice carried absolute conviction. "Kozlov Cell is planning to attack the Trans-Alaska pipeline system. If they succeed, the economic and environmental damage would be catastrophic. This is our one opportunity to stop them." The weight of responsibility settled over the team like a heavy blanket. They weren't just risking their lives for the sake of military objectives. They were preventing an attack that could affect millions of people. Morrison straightened his shoulders, and Sarah could see him transforming from an anxious young officer into a determined leader. Senior Chief, what do you need each of us to do to prepare? Rodriguez, you're our route specialist. I need you to memorize every landmark, every potential hazard, every alternative path between here and the target. If we get separated, you need to be able to guide anyone back to safety. Rodriguez nodded. Understood, Senior Chief. Chun, you're responsible for ensuring that our explosives will function reliably in sub-zero temperatures. I need you to test every charge, every detonator, every circuit until you're absolutely certain they'll work when we need them. Yes, Senior Chief. I'll run full environmental tests on everything. Bradley, communications will be our lifeline. I need you to establish checkpoint protocols with headquarters, set up emergency frequencies, and prepare backup communication methods in case our primary systems fail. I'll have multiple redundant systems ready, Senior Chief. Sarah turned to Morrison last. Lieutenant, you're my second in command. Your job is to know this mission as well as I do. If something happens to me, you need to be able to lead this team to successful completion. The responsibility of that role was not lost on Morrison. I won't let you down, Senior Chief. I'm counting on it, Sarah replied. Then she addressed the entire team. Gentlemen, we insert in 60 hours. Use the time wisely. Rest, prepare, and make your peace with whatever gods you pray to. Because once we cross that line of departure, we belong to the mountain and the ice. As the men filed out to begin their individual preparations, Sarah remained behind, staring at the map of their target area. She had led teams in difficult conditions before, but never with stakes this high and conditions this extreme. The success of the mission would depend not just on their individual skills, but on their ability to function as a unit when the environment itself was trying to kill them. She thought about the young lieutenant and the weight of responsibility she had just placed on his shoulders. Morrison reminded her of herself 8 years earlier. Eager, competent, but untested by the kind of adversity that revealed who you really were under pressure. The next 60 hours would be crucial, not just for mission preparation, but for forging 5 individual soldiers into a team capable of achieving the impossible. Because in the world of Winter Siren, impossible was just another word for Tuesday. The helicopter's rotors beat a violent rhythm against the Arctic air as it carved through the darkness toward the insertion point. Inside the aircraft, 5 figures sat in absolute silence, each lost in the private thoughts that preceded missions from which not everyone returned. The temperature outside had already dropped to minus 28 degrees, and they were still an hour from their destination. Sarah Martinez checked her chronometer for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Timing was everything on a mission like this. The weather window that would allow their insertion was narrow, maybe 6 hours of marginally flyable conditions before the next storm system moved in from the north. After that, they would be committed to completing the mission regardless of circumstances, because extraction would become impossible. Lieutenant Morrison sat across from her, his face pale, but determined behind the specialized cold weather mask that covered everything except his eyes. She could see him running through the mission parameters in his mind, checking and rechecking details that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Rodriguez had his eyes closed, but Sarah knew he wasn't sleeping. The mountain warfare specialist was visualizing the route they would take across 12 miles of hostile terrain, memorizing landmarks that might be invisible in the blowing snow, but could guide them to their objective if everything else went wrong. Chen was making final adjustments to the explosive charges secured in his pack. Each device had been tested and retested for reliability in extreme cold, but Chen was the type of soldier who checked everything one more time. His life and the lives of his teammates depended on those charges working perfectly when the moment came. Bradley monitored the communications equipment, maintaining contact with headquarters while they still could. Once they were on the ground, they would be essentially alone until the mission was complete. The mountainous terrain and weather conditions would make regular communication impossible. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. 5 minutes to LZ. Winds are gusting to 40 knots. Temperature is minus 31 degrees. Visibility is less than a quarter mile. This is going to be a fast drop, people. I can't maintain position for more than 30 seconds. Sarah keyed her microphone. Understood, pilot. We'll be ready. She looked at each member of her team, seeing the tension and determination in their eyes. These men had volunteered for a mission that pushed the limits of human endurance in an environment that killed people simply through exposure. The fact that they were here, now, spoke to a level of courage that went beyond normal military service. Equipment check, Sarah ordered, and each man quickly verified that his gear was secure and ready for immediate use. In the extreme cold they were about to face, a loose strap or malfunctioning zipper could become a death sentence. Remember, Sarah continued, once we're on the ground, we move fast and we move quiet. The insertion point is 8 miles from the target, which gives us some margin for error, but not much. Stay close, follow Rodriguez's lead on the route, and don't try to be a hero. Heroes freeze to death in conditions like this. Morrison nodded, understanding that her warning was directed primarily at him. Young officers had a tendency to take risks to prove themselves, and this mission offered no margin for that kind of mistake. The helicopter began its descent, and through the small windows, they could see nothing but swirling white chaos. The pilot was flying on instruments alone, trusting in technology and skill to find a landing zone that existed more as a set of coordinates than as a visible location. 30 seconds, the pilot announced, and Sarah could hear the strain in his voice. Flying in these conditions was only marginally less dangerous than what her team was about to attempt on foot. The aircraft touched down with a bone-jarring impact, the landing skids sliding several feet on the icy surface before finding purchase. Sarah was first out the door, dropping into snow that came up to her knees despite the specialized shoes designed for this terrain. The cold hit her like a physical blow, penetrating even the advanced protective clothing she wore. Her breath formed instant clouds of ice crystals that were whipped away by winds that felt like frozen knives against any exposed skin. "Move, move, move," she shouted, though her voice was barely audible above the rotor wash and howling wind. One by one, her team members emerged from the helicopter and formed a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. Rodriguez was already consulting his compass and GPS unit, oriented himself to their surroundings despite the zero visibility conditions. Chun secured his explosive charges and checked to ensure none had been damaged during the insertion. Bradley established a final communication check with headquarters before they moved beyond radio range. Morrison counted heads and confirmed that all equipment had been successfully offloaded. The helicopter lifted off within seconds of their departure, disappearing into the white void like a mirage. Suddenly, the 5-man team was alone in a landscape that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to venture into it. Sarah oriented herself to Rodriguez's position and began the trek toward their objective. The snow was deeper than anticipated, and each step required tremendous effort just to maintain forward progress. The wind was a constant enemy, driving ice crystals into their faces and threatening to knock them off balance with every gust. Within the first mile, the reality of their situation became clear. This wasn't just a difficult mission. It was a race against time and weather conditions that grew worse with each passing hour. The temperature was dropping faster than predicted, and the wind was increasing in strength. Rodriguez stopped suddenly and held up his hand, signaling the team to halt. Sarah moved up beside him, following his gaze toward what appeared to be a break in the terrain ahead. "Crevasse," Rodriguez shouted into her ear, his voice barely audible even at close range. "Maybe 50 feet deep. We need to find a way around." The detour would add precious time to their journey, but falling into a crevasse in these conditions would mean certain death. Sarah consulted her map and compass, trying to determine the safest route around the obstacle. "This way," she decided, pointing to their left. "We'll parallel the crevasse for half a mile, then cut back toward the primary route." The team reformed and continued their advance, now struggling not just with the weather and terrain, but with the additional distance their safety measures required. Each step was becoming more difficult as the cold penetrated their protective clothing and sapped their strength. Morrison was beginning to show signs of distress. His breathing was labored, and Sarah could see him struggling to maintain the pace Rodriguez was setting. Altitude, cold, and physical exertion were combining to push the young lieutenant toward his limits. "Rodriguez," Sarah called out, "reduce pace by 10%. The mountain warfare specialist immediately slowed their advance, understanding that the team could only move as fast as its weakest member. In extreme environments, team cohesion was more important than speed. After 2 hours of brutal progress, they had covered less than 4 miles. The weather was deteriorating even faster than the forecasters had predicted, and Sarah began to realize they might not reach the target before the storm made movement impossible. Chin moved up beside her during a brief rest stop, his face grim behind his protective mask. "Senior Chief, at this pace, we're going to miss our window. The explosives have a limited battery life in these temperatures." Sarah understood the implication. If they didn't reach the target within the next few hours, the mission would become impossible regardless of their determination to complete it. "We're going to have to take more risks," she decided. "Rodriguez, plot the most direct route to the target. Forget about the safety margins." Rodriguez studied his map and GPS readings. "Senior Chief, the direct route takes us across terrain that's marked as unstable. Avalanche danger, hidden crevasses, the whole area is basically a death trap." "It's a death trap if we go slow and careful," Sarah replied. "But if we move fast and light, we might be able to cross it before the conditions trigger a slide." The decision represented the kind of calculated risk that defines special operations. They were choosing between a slow death by exposure and the possibility of quick death by avalanche. Either way, safety was no longer an option. Bradley checked in with headquarters for what would likely be their last communication before reaching the target. "Command, this is Siren Team. We are behind schedule, but continuing to objective. Estimate arrival in 4 hours." The response was barely audible through the static and interference caused by the storm. "Copy, Siren Team. Weather conditions deteriorating faster than predicted. You are authorized to modify mission parameters as needed for successful completion." Sarah understood the coded message. Headquarters was giving her permission to take whatever risks were necessary to complete the mission. They were on their own now, committed to success regardless of the cost. The team began moving again, this time taking the direct route toward their objective. The terrain was even more treacherous than Rodriguez had predicted, with hidden obstacles that appeared suddenly out of the blowing snow. Morrison stumbled and nearly fell on what appeared to be solid ground, but was actually a snow-covered hole that could have dropped him 30 feet on a rocks below. Chun caught the lieutenant's arm at the last second, pulling him back from what would have been a mission-ending accident. "Stay alert," Sarah called out, though she knew that alertness was becoming increasingly difficult as exhaustion and cold began affecting their judgment. The human body wasn't designed to function in conditions this extreme. As they crossed a particularly exposed section of terrain, Rodriguez suddenly dropped to the ground and motioned for the team to take cover. Through the swirling snow, he had spotted something that shouldn't have been there. Sarah crawled up beside him and followed his pointing finger. About 200 yards ahead, barely visible in the storm, was a structure that didn't appear on any of their maps. It looked like some kind of observation post or shelter. "That's not supposed to be there," Rodriguez whispered, consulting his map again to confirm their position. Sarah studied the structure through her binoculars, trying to determine whether it was occupied. After several minutes of observation, she spotted movement inside what appeared to be a window. "Enemy scout post," she concluded. "They've established security positions further out than intelligence indicated." The presence of enemy forces this far from the main target changed everything. It meant that Kozlov's people were more organized and better prepared than anyone had anticipated. It also meant that the element of surprise might already be compromised. Chun moved up beside them. "Senior Chief, if they've spotted our helicopter insertion, They might already know we're coming. Sarah considered their options. They could try to bypass the observation post, but that would mean moving across terrain that offered no concealment. They could attack the position, but that would alert the main force to their presence. Or they could abort the mission, but that was no longer an option given the stakes involved. We take them out, she decided. Quietly, efficiently, and without alerting anyone else to our presence. The assault on the observation post would be their first real test as a team. Everything they had endured to reach this point had been preparation. Now, they would discover whether they could function as a combat unit in conditions that challenged the limits of human capability. Sarah began planning the attack, studying the terrain, and trying to determine the best approach to the enemy position. The storm that had made their journey so difficult would now become their ally, providing the concealment they needed to approach without being detected. Rodriguez, you and Chin approach from the left. Morrison and Bradley take the right side. I'll provide overwatch and coordinate the assault. She checked her chronometer. We move in 5 minutes. Remember, this has to be silent. If we alert the main force, the mission is over before it really begins. The team prepared for their first combat action, checking weapons and adjusting equipment for the close-quarters fighting that was about to commence. Each man understood that this was the moment when their training would be tested against reality. As they prepared to assault the enemy position, Sarah reflected on how quickly their situation had evolved. They had gone from a simple infiltration mission to a combat operation in hostile territory during some of the worst weather conditions on Earth. But this was what Winter Siren had been created for, missions that existed at the intersection of impossible and necessary, where success required not just skill and courage, but the ability to adapt when everything went wrong. The storm continued to howl around them as they prepared to begin the violent portion of their mission. In the distance, their primary objective waited, unaware that Winter Siren was coming for them through the frozen hell of the Alaskan wilderness. Sarah Martinez moved through the blowing snow with the fluid grace of a predator approaching unsuspecting prey. The observation post loomed ahead through the white curtain of the storm, its occupants unaware that Winter Siren had found them. The structure appeared to be a hastily constructed shelter, probably built to monitor the approaches to the main terrorist facility. Through her scope, Sarah could see 2 figures inside the post. Armed men who were more focused on staying warm than maintaining proper security protocols. Their lack of discipline would be their undoing, but it also confirmed what she had suspected about Viktor Kozlov's organization. These weren't elite soldiers. They were opportunists who had underestimated the challenges of operating in this environment. Rodriguez and Chun had worked their way around to the left side of the position, using the terrain and weather to mask their approach. Sarah could barely see them through the snow, which meant the enemy definitely couldn't detect their movement. Morrison and Bradley were positioned on the right, waiting for her signal to begin the coordinated assault. Sarah keyed her radio, using the short-range communication system that would allow the team to coordinate without alerting anyone outside their immediate area. All positions report ready. The responses came back quickly and quietly. Each team member was in position and prepared to execute their part of the assault plan. "Execute on my mark," Sarah transmitted. 3, 2, 1 mark. The assault began with deadly efficiency. Rodriguez appeared at the left window of the observation post like a ghost materializing from the storm. His suppressed weapon fired twice, the sound barely audible above the howling wind. Through her scope, Sarah saw both enemy sentries drop without having time to raise an alarm. Chun immediately moved to secure any intelligence materials while Rodriguez confirmed that the threats had been neutralized. Morrison and Bradley maintained overwatch, ensuring that no other enemy forces were approaching the position. "Position secure," Rodriguez reported over the radio. "To enemy Kia, no alerts transmitted." Sarah moved down from her overwatch position to join the team at the captured observation post. The structure was crude but effective, providing protection from the elements while maintaining clear sight lines across the approaches to the main target. Inside, Chun had discovered a radio system and what appeared to be a duty roster. "Senior Chief, They've been maintaining regular check-ins with the main facility. Next scheduled contact is in 2 hours. This information changed their tactical timeline. They would need to either maintain the deception for 2 hours or accelerate their assault on the main target to prevent the missed check-in from alerting Kozlov's forces. Sarah examined the radio equipment, noting that it was more sophisticated than intelligence reports had indicated. They're better organized than we thought. This isn't just a group of terrorists hiding in the wilderness. They've established a proper security perimeter. Morrison studied the duty roster that Chun had found. According to this, they have at least 12 personnel at the main facility, plus roving patrols that check in every 4 hours. Bradley was monitoring the radio frequencies, trying to intercept communications between the various elements of Kozlov's organization. Senior Chief, I'm picking up encrypted transmissions. Short bursts, very professional protocol. These people have military training. The intelligence picture was becoming clearer, and it wasn't encouraging. Instead of facing a small group of amateurs, Sarah's team was up against what appeared to be a well-organized cell with proper military communications and security procedures. Rodriguez was studying the view from the observation post, using binoculars to examine the terrain between their current position and the main target. I can see the entrance to their facility. It's about 1.5 miles from here, built into the side of the mountain. Natural camouflage, defensible position. Sarah joined him at the window, studying their objective through her own optics. The terrorist facility was more extensive than aerial reconnaissance had indicated. What appeared from above to be a simple cave entrance was actually the visible portion of a complex that extended deep into the mountainside. Chen, what's your assessment of the structural vulnerabilities? The explosives expert examined the photographs they had taken during their approach, comparing them with the intelligence materials found in the observation post. The main entrance is the obvious target, but if they have multiple escape routes, collapsing it might just trap them temporarily. We need to find the ventilation shafts and emergency exits. Sarah made a command decision that would define the rest of their mission. We're changing the plan. Instead of a simple demolition operation, we're going to conduct a full assault. We need to neutralize the personnel and destroy their capability to operate from this location. The shift from a demolition mission to an assault operation increased both the complexity and the risk exponentially. Instead of placing charges and withdrawing, they would need to fight their way into a defended position and eliminate all resistance. Morrison raised the obvious concern. Senior Chief, we're outnumbered at least 2 to 1, possibly worse. And they're defending prepared positions. Which is why we're going to use every advantage we have, Sarah replied. The weather, the terrain, and the element of surprise. They think they're safe up here because no sane person would attempt an assault in these conditions. Bradley had been monitoring enemy communications and had additional information. I'm intercepting planning discussions about their attack on the pipeline. They're planning to execute in 48 hours. If we don't stop them now, they'll be gone before anyone can mount another operation. The timeline pressure made their decision even more critical. This wasn't just about neutralizing a terrorist cell. It was about preventing an attack that could have catastrophic environmental and economic consequences. Sarah began developing the assault plan, using the intelligence they had gathered and the tactical advantages their situation provided. Rodriguez, you and Chim will approach from the north, using the ravine to mask your movement. Morrison and Bradley will create a diversion on the south side to draw their attention away from the main assault. She pointed to specific locations on the map they had found in the observation post. I'll infiltrate through the main entrance while they're focused on the diversionary attacks. Once I'm inside, I'll disable their communications and open alternate routes for the rest of the team. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its requirements. Sarah would be entering a defended facility alone, relying on surprise and her individual skills to survive until her team could support her. Chen raised a practical concern about the explosives requirements. Senior Chief, if we're going inside the facility, we need different charges. Cave-in explosives won't work if we're trapped inside when they detonate. Adapt the charges for targeted demolition, Sarah ordered. Destroy their communications equipment weapons storage, and any materials related to the pipeline attack. We'll worry about structural damage after we've secured the facility. The team began preparing for what would be the most challenging phase of their mission. The weather conditions that had made their approach so difficult would now become tactical factors in a combat operation against an entrenched enemy. Rodriguez plotted the approach routes, identifying covered positions and potential fallback points if the assault went wrong. Chen reconfigured his explosives for the new mission requirements, preparing charges that could destroy specific targets without bringing down the entire cave system. Bradley established communications protocols that would allow the team to coordinate during the assault while maintaining contact with headquarters. Morrison, despite his relative inexperience, began to demonstrate the leadership qualities that had earned him selection for this mission. Senior Chief, if something happens to you during the infiltration, what are the priorities for completing the mission? Sarah appreciated the question because it showed Morrison was thinking beyond his own survival to the successful completion of their objectives. Priority 1 is destroying their operational capability, communications, weapons, plans. Priority 2 is eliminating key personnel, especially Kozlov, if possible. Priority 3 is preventing their escape to conduct operations elsewhere. As they prepared to leave the observation post, Sarah took one last look at the duty roster they had captured. The names meant nothing to her, but the organizational structure revealed a level of professionalism that concerned her. These weren't desperate amateurs. They were skilled operators who had chosen to use their training for terrorist purposes. One more thing, Sarah addressed her team before they began their final approach. If this goes wrong, if we get separated or overwhelmed, remember that preventing their pipeline attack takes priority over everything else, including our own survival. The weight of that statement settled over the team like a heavy blanket. They were being asked to sacrifice themselves if necessary to prevent an attack on civilian infrastructure. It was the kind of decision that defined special operations, choosing mission success over personal survival when the stakes were high enough. Rodriguez secured the observation post, ensuring that it would appear normal to any casual inspection while removing anything that might alert the enemy to their presence. Shun double-checked his explosive charges one final time, knowing that equipment failure during the assault would likely mean death for all of them. Bradley tested the short-range communication system that would keep them coordinated during the chaotic minutes of combat that lay ahead. Morrison reviewed the assault plan once more, memorizing every detail that might mean the difference between success and disaster. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the observation post, the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was trying to discourage their suicidal assault on the terrorist facility. The wind howled with increased fury, and the temperature continued to drop toward levels that challenged human survival. Sarah checked her chronometer and realized they had been on the ground for 6 hours. The weather window for extraction was closing rapidly, which meant they would need to complete their mission and reach the alternate extraction point within the next 12 hours or risk being stranded in the wilderness until spring. "Time to go hunting," Sarah announced, using the phrase that had become her signature before beginning combat operations. It was a reminder that they were the predators in this situation, despite being outnumbered and operating in hostile territory. The team departed the observation post in tactical formation, moving through the storm toward a confrontation that would test every skill they possessed. Ahead lay a facility full of trained killers who had chosen this location specifically because they believed it was impossible to assault. They were about to discover that impossible was just another word in Winter Siren's vocabulary, and she was fluent in the language of violence in all its forms. The assault began at 0347 hours with Morrison and Bradley's diversionary attack on the south face of the terrorist facility. Their suppressed weapons created the illusion of a much larger force probing the defenses, drawing the attention of Kozlov's security teams away from the main entrance, where Sarah was preparing to infiltrate. Through her night vision goggles, Sarah watched the enemy response to the diversion. Armed figures emerged from concealed positions, moving with the discipline and coordination that confirmed these were trained operators rather than amateur terrorists. Their tactical movement and communication suggested military backgrounds, probably former Spetsnaz like their leader. Rodriguez and Chen were in position on the north side of the facility, waiting for Sarah's signal to begin their own assault. The plan required precise timing. Each element of the attack had to support the others, or the entire operation would collapse in a chaos. Sarah began her infiltration, moving through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without her years of experience in extreme environment operations. The main entrance was guarded, but the guard's attention was focused on the diversionary attack happening on the opposite side of the facility. The entrance itself was a natural cave opening that had been modified with reinforced doors and defensive positions. Sarah could see that considerable effort had been invested in making this location defensible, which suggested Kozlov intended to use it as a long-term base of operations. Using techniques perfected during years of covert operations, Sarah bypassed the exterior security and found herself inside the cave system. The interior was more extensive than intelligence had indicated, with multiple levels connected by both natural passages and artificially constructed tunnels. She could hear voices echoing through the stone corridors, speaking in what sounded like Russian mixed with English. The conversation suggested confusion about the attack outside and uncertainty about how to respond. This was exactly the kind of disruption Sarah had hoped to create. Moving deeper into the facility, Sarah located what appeared to be the communication center. The equipment was sophisticated, confirming that Kozlov's organization had access to military-grade technology. She placed one of Chen's specialized charges against the primary radio console, setting a timer that would give her enough time to complete her mission before destroying their ability to coordinate with outside forces. The next priority was locating the materials related to the pipeline attack. Sarah found what appeared to be a planning room filled with maps, photographs, and technical diagrams. The scope of the planned attack was more extensive than anyone had realized. They weren't just planning to damage the pipeline. They were planning to create an environmental disaster that would contaminate hundreds of square miles. She photographed the critical documents with a camera designed to function in extreme conditions, ensuring that intelligence analysts would have access to the full scope of Kozlov's plans, even if the physical materials were destroyed. A sound in the corridor outside alerted Sarah to approaching footsteps. She positioned herself beside the entrance to the planning room, weapon ready, as two armed men entered the space. Her suppressed pistol eliminated both threats before they could raise an alarm, but their absence would eventually be noticed. Sarah activated her radio to signal the next phase of the assault. Siren, lead to all elements. Phase 2, execute. Rodriguez and Chen began their assault on the north entrance, using explosives to breach the defensive positions while Sarah created chaos inside the facility. The sound of combat echoed through the stone passages as the two-pronged attack confused and disrupted the enemy's ability to mount an organized defense. Morrison and Bradley intensified their diversionary attack, making it appear that the main assault was coming from the south while the real threat materialized from multiple directions. The psychological impact of being attacked from three sides simultaneously was exactly what Sarah had hoped to achieve. Moving through the facility, Sarah encountered resistance that was fierce but disorganized. Kozlov's people were skilled individual fighters, but they lacked the team coordination necessary to deal with a multi-directional assault in confined spaces. She found herself in what appeared to be a weapons storage area, filled with the materials necessary to carry out attacks on civilian infrastructure. Chen's explosives would ensure that none of these weapons could be used against innocent people, but first she needed to locate Viktor Kozlov himself. The facility's leader was exactly where Sarah expected to find him, in the deepest, most defensible part of the cave system, surrounded by his most trusted operatives. Through careful reconnaissance, she identified 7 people in what appeared to be a command post, including one figure whose bearing and authority marked him as the leader. Sarah had 2 options: attempt to capture Kozlov for intelligence purposes, or eliminate him and his entire leadership structure to ensure they could never regroup. Given the conditions and the limited time available, she chose elimination. The assault on the command post required every skill Sarah had developed during her years in special operations. Moving through passages barely wide enough for a single person, she positioned charges that would collapse the escape routes while leaving her a path to reach her targets. When she finally entered the command post, the effect was instantaneous and devastating. Kozlov and his remaining operatives found themselves facing Winter Siren in person, and their shocked recognition told her that her reputation had preceded her even into this remote facility. The firefight was brief but intense. Kozlov's people were skilled, but they were trapped in a confined space against an opponent who specialized in close-quarters combat in extreme environments. When the shooting stopped, Winter Siren was the only person left standing in the command post. Sarah activated the charges she had placed throughout the facility, beginning with the communications center. The explosions echoed through the cave system like thunder, systematically destroying the terrorist organization's capability to operate from this location. Rodriguez and Chun had secured the north entrance and were moving through the facility, eliminating any remaining resistance. Morrison and Bradley had fought their way in from the south, completing the pincer movement that had trapped Kozlov's forces between multiple assault teams. The entire operation, from initial infiltration to final elimination, had taken less than 45 minutes. When the explosions stopped and the gunfire ended, Viktor Kozlov's terrorist organization no longer existed as an operational threat. Bradley established contact with headquarters to report mission completion. Command, this is Siren Team. Objective secured, threat neutralized, intelligence materials recovered. The response came through the static-filled radio transmission. Copy, Siren Team. Outstanding work. Extract to alternate LZ immediately. Weather window closing rapidly. Sarah assembled her team at the destroyed entrance to the facility, conducting a quick accountability and casualty assessment. Rodriguez had suffered minor injuries from flying stone during the explosive breaches. Morrison had a cut on his face from a ricochet, but nothing that would prevent him from continuing. Chun and Bradley were uninjured. The extraction to the alternate landing zone will be the final test of their endurance and teamwork. 20 miles across some of the most hostile terrain in North America, in weather conditions that were continuing to deteriorate. As they began the trek toward extraction, Sarah reflected on what they had accomplished. They had prevented an attack that could have caused catastrophic environmental damage while eliminating a terrorist organization that had posed a continuing threat to civilian infrastructure. More importantly, they had done it as a team. Morrison had overcome his inexperience to become an effective combat leader. Rodriguez had navigated impossible terrain under impossible conditions. Chun had adapted his explosives expertise to achieve mission objectives that changed during execution. Bradley had maintained communications that kept them coordinated throughout the operation. The journey to the extraction point tested their remaining physical and mental reserves. The storm had intensified to the point where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. The temperature had dropped below minus 40 degrees, creating conditions that challenged the limits of their protective equipment. Rodriguez, despite his injuries, continued to navigate with the precision that had made him invaluable throughout the mission. His ability to find the correct route in zero visibility conditions was the difference between successful extraction and death by exposure. 3 hours into the extraction trek, they encountered their final challenge. A section of terrain that had been stable during their approach had been destabilized by recent snowfall, creating an avalanche zone that blocked their planned route. Chun solved the problem with characteristic ingenuity, using small explosive charges to trigger a controlled avalanche that cleared the unstable snow while creating a path through the obstacle. The technique was dangerous, but less dangerous than attempting to traverse unstable terrain in the middle of a blizzard. As they neared the extraction point, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the wind. The pilot was pushing the limits of what was possible in these weather conditions, risking his own life to ensure that Winter Siren's team made it home safely. The helicopter extraction was executed with the same precision that had characterized the entire mission. Despite winds that threatened to knock the aircraft out of the sky, the pilot maintained position long enough for all 5 team members to board safely. As they lifted off from the Alaskan wilderness, Sarah looked down at the terrain that had tested them so severely. Somewhere below, buried under tons of snow and rock, lay the remains of a terrorist organization that had underestimated what Winter Siren was capable of achieving. The flight back to base gave Sarah time to consider what they had accomplished and what it meant for her career and her team. They had succeeded in a mission that many would have considered impossible, proving that proper training, preparation, and teamwork could overcome even the most hostile conditions. Morrison sat across from her in the helicopter, no longer the uncertain young officer who had questioned his qualifications for the mission. Combat had revealed his true capabilities, and Sarah knew he would be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead in his career. Rodriguez, Chun, and Bradley had each contributed skills that were essential to mission success. More importantly, they had demonstrated the ability to adapt and overcome when circumstances changed, which was the defining characteristic of elite special operations personnel. When they finally arrived at headquarters, word of their success had already spread throughout the special operations community. The mission that everyone had assumed would be Winter Siren's final operation had instead become another chapter in a legend that would inspire future generations of warriors. In the debriefing sessions that followed, Sarah was asked repeatedly about the keys to success in extreme environment operations. Her answer was always the same: respect the environment, trust your team, and never underestimate the power of proper preparation combined with adaptive execution. The pipeline attack that Kozlov had planned never occurred. The intelligence materials recovered during the mission led to the identification and arrest of terrorist cells in 3 other countries. The ripple effects of Operation Northern Sweep continued to protect civilian infrastructure for years after the mission was completed. For Sarah Martinez, the mission represented vindication of everything she had worked to achieve throughout her career. She had proven that Winter Siren was more than just a legend whispered in dark corners. She was a real person with real capabilities, leading real teams to accomplish missions that protected innocent people from those who would do them harm. The young officers who had dismissed her in that conference room at Fort Bragg learned valuable lessons about assumptions and respect. More importantly, they learned that the most dangerous person in any room might be the one who looks like they don't belong there. Lieutenant Morrison went on to have a distinguished career in special operations, always crediting his first mission with Winter Siren as the experience that taught him the difference between training and reality. He never again made assumptions about people based on their appearance or apparent qualifications. Sarah continued to serve in roles that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in military operations. Her reputation as Winter Siren became a recruiting tool for attracting the best personnel to the most challenging missions. But perhaps most importantly, she had demonstrated that excellence in special operations wasn't about individual heroics or masculine bravado. It was about careful planning, precise execution, and the ability to lead teams that could overcome any obstacle through coordinated effort and mutual trust. Years later, when young officers asked about the secrets of Winter Siren's success, the answer was always the same. She earned respect by being better prepared, more adaptable, and more committed to mission success than anyone else in the room. She never asked for recognition or special treatment. She simply delivered results that spoke for themselves. In the end, that was the true legacy of Winter Siren. Not the individual missions or personal achievements, but the example she set for future generations of warriors who would face their own impossible missions in service to their country and their fellow citizens. The legend continued to grow, not because of the mystique surrounding her operations, but because of the very real impact she had on protecting the innocent and defeating those who threatened the freedoms that others took for granted. Winter Siren had become more than a person. She had become a standard of excellence that would inspire and challenge special operations personnel for decades to come.